Okay, so for thousands of years, art pretty much looked one way. Rigid, unchanging, and totally governed by these strict rules. And then, suddenly, in ancient Greece, over just a couple of centuries, everything changed. Today, we're going to dive into that explosive creative revolution and figure out what exactly set it all off.
And this really brings us to this central mystery, right? I mean, think about it. You had these massive empires building pyramids and sphinxes, creating this powerful, incredible art that barely changed for millennia. Then, all of a sudden, on the shores of the Mediterranean, art becomes dynamic, it's realistic, it's alive. So what happened? Well, that's what we're here to figure out.
This slide gets to the absolute heart of it all. See, on one side, you have the art of empires, like Egypt, which was based on a formula. It was all about what you knew a person looked like, kind of like a visual instruction manual. But on the other side, you have the Greeks, who pioneered art based on observation, what you can actually see with your own two eyes. And this fundamental clash is what sparked the whole revolution.
Now, to really get why the Greek breakthrough was so huge, we first have to understand the world they were breaking away from. For thousands of years, art was basically stuck in time, playing by a very, very strict set of rules.
The Egyptian approach, for instance, wasn't about capturing what something really looked like. Nope. It was all about clarity and permanence. So an artist would draw a head in profile because that's its clearest view, right? But then they'd draw the eye from the front, the torso from the front, but the feet from the side. They were literally piecing together a person from their most characteristic parts, like building something from a kit, not drawing what a real person actually looked like.
And then came the Greeks. Sometime between the 7th and 5th centuries BC, artists started trying something totally new. They made this incredibly radical decision to trust what they saw with their own eyes over what they had been taught for centuries.
And this was the core of the whole revolution, a massive shift from knowledge to observation. It was the difference between drawing the idea of a person and drawing the actual person standing right in front of you with all their weird angles and shadows and imperfections. Artists began to use their eyes as their #1 tool.
This might sound a little abstract, so let's make it super simple. Let's just talk about a knee. Early Greek statues looked very Egyptian, stiff, with maybe a simple groove carved in for the kneecap. But then the Greek artists started experimenting. They started asking, wait a minute, what does a knee actually look like when it bends? And so they started looking at real models, at athletes. And they began to carve the complex, beautiful, and anatomically correct forms that we still marvel at today. This new way of seeing wasn't just about knees, of course. It led to this incredible cascade of discoveries that completely changed how you could represent our three-dimensional world on a flat, two-dimensional surface.
So around 500 BC, Greek vase painters had this huge breakthrough, foreshortening. For the very first time, an artist dared to paint a foot as seen from the front, not in its familiar side profile, but as this compressed, almost circular shape. Now that might sound like a tiny detail, but as the art historian E.H. Gonridge said, this was a tremendous moment. Why? Because it just shattered a 1,000-year-old rule.
With that one simple drawing of a foot, the ancient rule was just gone. The rule that said you must show every part of an object from its most recognizable angle was broken. Artists were now free. They could finally trust their own eyes. If part of a body was hidden or looked kind of strange from a certain angle, well, they could draw it that way. And that, right there, opened the door to realism.
And this new focus on the human experience wasn't just happening in painting. Just look at their architecture. The Doric temples, like the famous Parthenon, were a world away from the giant, overwhelming pyramids of Egypt. These buildings were designed with a sense of harmony and proportion that was built for human beings, not to dwarf them into insignificance. It was architecture that celebrated human scale and human intellect.
Okay, so they've nailed how to represent form realistically. But their next great challenge? It was even harder. How do you capture the very essence of life itself? How do you capture movement?
And this is where sculptors like Myron come into the picture. With his famous sculpture, the Discobolus, or the discus thrower, he didn't just carve a static pose. No way. He carefully studied a real athlete and then chose the single, most perfect, most dramatic moment in the entire action. That tiny split second of calm right before the explosive release. He managed to capture not just a body, but a body caught in the middle of motion.
This new realism even changed how people saw their own gods. Before this, gods were often shown as these formidable magical demons or really stiff, scary idols. But then the great sculptor Phidias came along and created statues of gods, like his gigantic Athena for the Parthenon, that were dignified and, well, deeply human-like.
Their power didn't come from scary faces or magic wands, but from their sheer perfection of form. They were like idealized humans, not terrifying monsters from another world.
So what was the secret sauce for the Greek success? It was this incredible balance. See, they didn't just throw out all the old knowledge. They respected the structure and harmony they learned from earlier traditions, but they combined it with this amazing, unprecedented freedom to explore, to experiment, and to observe the world for themselves. It was truly the perfect fusion of rules and freedom.
You know, the impact of this great awakening in art really can't be overstated, and a huge reason for that is because it wasn't just happening in art. This new way of thinking was popping up everywhere in Greek society.
And when you think about it, it makes perfect sense. At the very same time that artists were learning to observe the human body, you had scientists who were beginning to observe the natural world. You had philosophers questioning the very nature of reality, and citizens in Athens were developing democracy. The artistic revolution was really just one part of a much, much larger intellectual awakening.
At its absolute core, this was an era defined by a new spirit of inquiry. It didn't matter if it was art or science or politics, people began to question tradition. They stopped just accepting that things were the way they were because that's how they'd always been. Instead, they started to ask why, and they looked for the answers in the world all around them.
And that really leaves us with a final thought to chew on. The Greeks achieved something truly great by finding this perfect, delicate balance between the wisdom of established rules and the courage of individual freedom. They showed the world that true innovation happens when you know what to keep from the past and you know when to break from it. So the question for us is, in our own work, our own lives, and our own societies, how do we find that same balance today?